Let me start with a sentence everyone has heard 100 times. China needs to boost domestic demand. Every time Beijing says this, markets barely react. People just tune out. Same diagnosis, same slogans, no execution. So when China says it again, the default reaction is obvious. Here we go again. But here's a question I want to ask today. What if this time is actually different? Not because China suddenly discovered consumption, but because the context around it has changed in a way that forces the issue. First, let's be honest. Skepticism is completely rational in this regard. Back in 2024, right before the annual Central Economic Work Conference, many people thought consumption had finally moved up the priority list, including me. It was mentioned more often. Some policies appeared that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier, like childcare subsidies. Yet by the end of 2025, it was clear that consumption never became the top priority. Everything felt cautious and incremental. Consumption felt like just encouraged, but never fully embraced. So, when markets shrug this time again, that reaction makes total sense. This story has cried wolf for more than a decade. But something genuinely different has happened in recent weeks. First, Qiu Shi, the Communist Party's top theoretical journal, published a curated series of speech by Xi Jinping on domestic demand. This wasn't random. Two things immediately stood out. First, according to Xi, domestic demand was framed explicitly as a strategic issue, not just an economic objective. Second, a 2023 passage was highlighted where Xi said something very direct. To boost consumption, you have to boost income. This is exactly the right diagnosis. It removes any ambiguity about whether the leadership knows the problem. If execution fails, it won't be because Beijing doesn't know what needs to be done. Soon after, a senior official went further, saying outright that expanding domestic demand will rank as a foremost priority next year. People's Daily, official mouthpiece, then explained why domestic demand now sits at number one among next year's many priorities. On paper, the signal could not be clearer. So why is the market still unconvinced? Because recognition has never been the constraint, execution has. So here's a framework I often use to understand China. China is an all-encompassing state. What I mean is, on paper, everything is always important. Growth, security, technology, ideology, healthcare. In reality, that's impossible. A system this large can only pursue a few objectives at a time. What matters is what sits at the very top of the priority stack. When something truly reaches that level, the system can move with astonishing force. And we've seen it before. Environmental enforcement, poverty alleviation, anti-corruption, just to name a few. China does priorities extremely well. The flip side is that it does non-priorities very poorly. Consumption has lived in that uncomfortable middle zone for years. Important in theory, never dominant in practice. And there's a very simple reason for that. Put yourself in the shoes of a local Chinese official. You've got roughly 3-year term. You are evaluated on GDP, jobs, physical revenue. Do you attract a factory line that shows up cleanly in the data? Or do you transfer income to households and hope it somehow turns into consumption instead of savings? The rational choice is obvious. Investment is fast, visible, and politically safe. Consumption, on the other hand, is indirect, uncertain, and physically unrewarding. And local governments are now physically strained after the property slump, which make this bias even stronger. This is why political slogans never work. Shifting the growth engine from investment to consumption isn't just a technocratic tweak. It requires consumption to sit at the absolute top of Beijing's priority list, backed by overwhelming top-down force and real changes to incentives. Anything less just dissipates. Once you see this, 2025 makes perfect sense. The real priority last year was not consumption. It was external pressure, trade tensions, geopolitics, and the second Trump administration. The entire system in China braced for that shock. Everything else became secondary. Now, here's where 2026 will look different. By the end of 2025, China hadn't won the trade war, but it clearly hadn't lost. More importantly, it absorbed the shock. It's now widely accepted that the US can't easily strangle China's economy through trade alone. The same shift happened in technology. Self-sufficiency still matters for China, but panic is gone. Developments in AI, DeepSeek have changed confidence. The narrative has moved from fear of choke points to confidence that no single bottleneck can halt progress. Xi himself recently put it bluntly during the economic conference, "It has proven impossible to bottleneck us." That sentence really matters because it frees up political bandwidth. There's also a social angle people often miss. On paper, 2024 and 25 look similar. Deflation, weak confidence, but they felt very different. In 2024, social anxiety was palpable in China. In 2025, external pressure dominated attention. Society entered a kind of quasi-war mode. Paradoxically, that diversion stabilized sentiment. But that pressure valve may not exist in 2026. If domestic demand doesn't recover meaningfully, China risks sliding back into 2024-style social tension, but this time without a credible external distraction. At that point, the system will have nowhere else to look. Action becomes unavoidable. That's why 2026 is structurally different from 2025. For the first time in years, Beijing may face both the willingness and the necessity to treat domestic demand not as rhetoric, not as just something nice to have, but as strategy. Nothing is guaranteed, execution risks remain huge, but this is no longer just the same old story repeated again. This is China Translated, where I make China make more sense to you. If you have any other questions about China, just post them at the comment section below, and I will try my best to answer.